When you think about businesses that are selling through the roof, like Aloe or Allbirds, sure, you think about a great product, a cool brand, and great marketing. But an often overlooked secret is actually the businesses behind the business, making selling, and for shoppers, buying, simple. For millions of businesses, that business is Shopify. Nobody does online business better than Shopify. It's home of Shop Pay, the #1 checkout in the world. You can use it to boost conversions up to 50%, meaning way less carts going abandoned and way more sales going through to checkout. Sign up for your $1 per month trial period at shopify.com/income, all lowercase. Go to shopify.com/income to upgrade your selling today. That's shopify.com/income.
The Presidencies of the United States is a proud member of the Evergreen Podcast Network. Hello and welcome to the Presidencies of the United States. I'm your host, Jerry Landry. As this is an episode of our special series, the Vice Presidencies of the United States, I am joined today by my co-host, Alex. Alex, how are you doing today?
I'm doing well. How about you?
I'm doing well. I'm excited to get back to recording. It's been a little bit since we've sat down and recorded.
Yeah.
And
What's happening?
Lots happening. It's definitely been a year for presidential history.
Yeah. Oh, yeah.
But we won't go into that because we want to talk about the history of the past. But before we get started, just wanted to remind you and our listeners of what happened the last time we sat down together. So the last episode that we recorded was Elbridge Gerry, who was the 5th Vice President of the United States. And do you remember what happened to Gerry?
It's been a while. Refresh my memory, please.
So Gerry is the 2nd Vice President to have died while in office.
Yes.
Now, if you'll remember, George Clinton, his predecessor in office, also died in office, but he only had a little bit to go in the remainder of his term. Gerry actually died in 1814, so that meant there were still a couple more years left in his term. And as we learned in our first President Pro Tempore episode, which covers kind of that interregnum period where there's no vice president because at the time they didn't replace the vice president. They didn't have a mechanism to do so, nor did they really see an importance to do so. But in that interregnum, the President Pro Tempore would serve as the presiding officer of the Senate. And so that's why with these episodes, we're looking at the people who served in that role. And today is John Gaillard. So, Alex, I'm pretty sure I know the answer to this question, but have you ever heard of John Gaillard?
Not before today.
I would be surprised if you had.
Is any relation to the liqueur Galliano? No, I'm just playing.
That I don't know, but let's see what we can find out.
I would posit a guess not.
Probably not. But he is actually from a neighboring state for us. John Gaillard was born on September 5th, 1765 in the St. Stephen's Parish of the province of South Carolina to John and Judith Payer Gaillard.
Okay, and where would the St. Stephen's Parish be in relation to modern day context?
So this was actually still in the Charlestown district. So South Carolina was divided up into various districts, but it's basically, if you know where modern day Charleston is, it was kind of to the north of there. It's a bit off the coast, a bit inland, but still in that coastal region.
Gotcha.
Yeah.
And I'm reading here, he was of Huguenot descent, which is interesting.
Yes. Well, and especially like the name, like, so his mother's maiden name was Payer, which is a French name, Gaillard, French name. And so it's interesting, you know, they have some French ancestry. I didn't really find much about that, but that's interesting that's the descent.
It's very interesting.
Your data is like gold to hackers. They're selling your passwords, bank details, and private messages. McAfee helps stop them. Secure VPN keeps your online activity private. AI-powered text scam detector spots phishing attempts instantly. And with award-winning antivirus, you get top-tier hacker protection. Plus, you'll get up to $2 million in identity theft coverage, all for just $39.99 for your first year. Visit McAfee.com. Cancel anytime. Terms apply.
So John was the oldest of the children that we know of. The next 6 children that we know of were born between 1766 and 1786. John Gaillard is one of those figures. I tried to find what information I could, but I also go ahead and invite folks to have your grains of salt at the ready, just in case there's something that I missed or anything that, we just don't know.
Mm-hmm.
So it appears that his parents, or at least his father, was a loyalist. Because in 1782, as the war was drawing to a close, his father took up the British offer to come under their protection, and the family moved to England.
Interesting.
John was trained in law in London's Middle Temple, but as is noted in the South Carolina Encyclopedia, quote, Gaillard's ambition lay in areas other than the law. So even though he did receive legal training, that really wasn't what he was drawn to. But at some point, it seems that the family returned to the United States because on March 6th, 1789, John's mother, Judith, passed away in Charleston at the age of either 42 or 43. We don't know when she was born, so still some question about that. On November 22nd, 1792, John wed Mary Lord. And at some point, he started acquiring land and was noted as being a plantation owner in St. Stephen and St. James Santee parishes. But that is as much detail as I was able to find about his business operations.
Very interesting.
We can assume that enslaved labor was involved, and that was pretty standard at the time.
Especially for that location.
In 1794, Gaillard was elected to the South Carolina State House of Representatives to represent St. Stephen's Parish, and he assumed his seat that year. John and Mary's first child, Edwin, was born in 1796, followed by Theodore Samuel, also born in 1796.
Oh, wow. That poor lady.
Theodore Samuel was born in November, while Edwin was in March, which is barely enough time in between to be plausible.
Goodness.
Yeah.
Seriously.
Yeah. Yeah.
That poor lady's literally like no time whatsoever.
No time whatsoever. Thankfully, their next child, Anna, was born in 1798, so she had a little time to recover.
Goodness. All right.
But in 1796, Gaillard also transitioned over to a seat in the South Carolina State Senate, again representing St. Stephen's Parish, so he was on the rise politically. Sadly, both Mary and their daughter Anna, and I said Anna was born in 1798, both mother and daughter died on May 16th, 1799.
Oh my goodness, what happened?
Unfortunately, I wasn't able to find any details, but at least one source stated that Mary died in a drowning accident, but does not note Anna's involvement with it. But if they died on the same day, you assume if there was an accident, they were both involved.
Goodness gracious.
To add insult to injury, May 16th was Anna's first birthday.
Oh my gosh.
Yeah.
Wow. Talk about a dark cloud.
Yeah. And Mary was only 26 when she passed away. Both of them were buried at St. Stephen's Episcopal Church Cemetery. So our John's father, John Sr., passed away on June 26, 1800, at the age of either 64 or 65. Again, we don't know his birth date. Gaillard was chosen as the president of the state senate in 1803, but he would not be in this position long before he got his next bump up in the political ladder. With Pierce Butler's resignation from his U.S. Senate seat in October 1804, the South Carolina state legislature had to choose his replacement to serve out the remainder of his term. Because we're talking about him, of course, they chose Gaillard, and he assumed his seat in December of that year. he would ultimately be reelected 4 times to full 6-year terms. So he was in the Senate for quite a while.
Mm-hmm.
During this time, I've only found a couple of items to note. As he was joining the U.S. Senate, he was also named as one of the presidential electors in 1804 and voted for Jefferson. Then in the summer of 1810, Gaillard wrote to Secretary of the Navy Paul Hamilton about intelligence that he had about enslaved individuals being illegally imported into the United States and South Carolina. So he is, and it's interesting because this was a time that there was still a strong support for the international slave trade in South Carolina, but Gaillard did provide information to try and combat that because at this point it was illegal.
Well, mark a little check there at least.
Yeah. We'll take anything we can get.
Yes, we can and will.
But like his fellow congressman from South Carolina, Gaillard voted in favor of the declaration of war against Great Britain in June 1812. On December 4th, 1812, Thomas Lair wrote to Madison about Gaillard's recent reelection as senator by a vote of 118 to Governor Middleton's 37 in the state legislature, and cites it as a reflection of Madison's popularity in the state and Gaillard's alignment with the administration. So the fact that he apparently, another prominent politico who had served as governor, Gaillard had more support in the state legislature. That does tell, how big of a role he played in South Carolina, at least. Gaillard served as the teller or the official counter of the electoral ballots for the U.S. Senate during the election of 1812. So we don't have too much to go on, but at least, we're seeing some activity. We're seeing something. Now, Gaillard had actually had a few tenures as president pro tempore that predated those of William H. Crawford, who we discussed in our last interregnum episode. And this was during those instances where the VP was absent at the beginning or the end of the session during the 11th Congress when George Clinton was VP.
Old P-Funk.
Old P-Funk. We talked about that. It had become kind of a tradition for the vice president to not be there at the beginning or the end of the session.
Okay.
But they needed somebody to preside, president pro tempore. Now, altogether, Gaillard served 25 days total in 3 different short stints. But after Crawford's tenure, he would serve again briefly at the end of a session in the 13th Congress before being called once more to this role upon the death of Vice President Elbridge Gerry. So with Gerry's death on November 23rd, 1814, the Senate needed someone to preside over the Senate through the end of Gerry's term, which would end on March 4th, 1817. Now, considering he had served so many brief stints before, I guess they figured Gaillard had as much experience as anyone.
Yeah.
And so thus, on November 25th, 1814, he was chosen as president pro tempore. And he would preside over a Senate in mourning before choosing a new presiding officer. They had agreed that, quote, the chair of the president of the Senate should be shrouded with black during the present session. And as a further testimony of respect for the memory of the deceased, the members of the Senate will go into mourning and wear black crape round the left arm for 30 days. Now, despite being in this position as the presiding officer of the Senate, Gaillard did sign on to a letter sent by him and other members of Congress to Madison on January 9th, 1815, appealing for, quote, a convoy for the protection of the trade between the southern states and Amelia Island. And so even though he's the presiding officer, he still is a sitting senator, and that's what makes this role interesting. If you're having to carry it out for a long period of time, you've still got to be a senator. You've still got a responsibility to the state that you're representing as one of 2 people representing that state. So it makes it difficult to be in that, neutral role of the presiding officer. When the 14th Congress convened on December 14th, 1815, they chose Gaillard again as president pro tem. During this tenure, Gaillard is noted as retreating a bit from his support for the Madison administration, as he voted against numerous key administration bills, including a protective tariff internal improvements, and the chartering of the Second Bank of the United States. However, as his entry in the South Carolina Encyclopedia notes, quote, Gaillard's reputation and the respect devolved upon him were perhaps aided by the fact that he was never a controversial figure. In a period of often contentious debates in Congress, Gaillard did not enter the fray. Most probably as the Senate's presiding officer, Gaillard felt that taking sides would be a breach of both decorum and the duties of his office. In an era of controversy, Gaillard was one of the few national political figures that appeared to his colleagues to be above the fray.
Good.
Yeah.
Good.
Now, he would continue to serve and be the next in line for the presidency until the term of Daniel D. Tompkins began on March 4th, 1817.
Mm-hmm.
On the last day of the second session of the 14th Congress, the Senate, quote, resolved unanimously that the thanks of the Senate be presented to the Honorable John Gaillard for the able and satisfactory manner in which he has discharged the duties of the President pro tempore of the Senate since his appointment to that office, and that this testimonial of their approbation and respect be entered upon their journal. Gaillard responded with the following brief remarks, quote, Gentlemen of the Senate, the approbation of a body so respectable and distinguished as that which I have now the honor to address is received with the most profound respect, and will ever be to me a source of pleasing and of grateful recollection. To the habits of order, of decorum, and attention to business, which so strongly mark the character of this honorable body, I have felt myself to be greatly indebted, but more, much more so, to that spirit of liberality and indulgence which has been extended to me on all occasions, and which has been ever ready to overlook my many deficiencies and errors, and to overrate my feeble, humble efforts, which have been directed with anxious solicitude to a faithful and impartial discharge of the duties of the chair.
Wow. What refreshing words.
I know, right? And he goes on, if in the course of my official conduct, it should have been my misfortune to have wounded the feelings of any honorable members, or in aught to have offended, I can assure them that such offense was unintentional on my part, and I pray them to accept this apology as an atonement. Permit me now, gentlemen, to tender to you collectively, as well as individually, my grateful acknowledgments for your kindness, and my warmest wishes for your prosperity and happiness.
Nice.
Yeah.
Again, so foreign to the state of politics now, but I digress.
Yes.
Nice.
Well, and I don't know if you remember Burr's farewell speech to the Senate.
Vaguely. Old Burr in the Saddle even had some, fairly gracious words to deliver.
And it speaks to kind of a trope of the time, this idea of admitting one's imperfections and apologizing for any offenses that may have been incurred. It definitely, if we're going to bring back some traditions from the past, let's start with that.
Hear, hear.
But after 829 days, inclusive of the days that the Senate was not in session, Gaillard's tenure as president pro tem and next in line for the presidency ended.
Mm-hmm.
Now, as we'll learn more about in Tompkins' episode, due to ill health, he would spend most of his time as vice president outside of the nation's capital. But when it was in session, the Senate still needed a presiding officer. Take a wild guess who they turned to.
John Gaillard?
John Gaillard.
All right.
He would
Why
serve.
wouldn't
Yeah. I mean, why wouldn't they? This guy has proven himself. He basically served out the rest of Gary's term. So, of course, they turned to him. And he would serve stints as president pro tempore in the 15th, 16th, 17th, and 18th Congresses.
Wow. Okay.
Now, during one of those stints, when he was serving as the president pro tempore in December 1820, the wife of Secretary of State Adams, Louisa Catherine Adams, reported back to her father-in-law of a dinner they attended on the 7th in which she interacted with Gaillard. She noted as follows, quote, Mr. Gaillard is always particular in his inquiries concerning the European courts when in conversation with me. He perhaps has some views or a leaning towards a mission. So at the time, being posted abroad diplomatically, it was seen as kind of being a good way to either advance your career or kind of wrap up your career. And for Gaillard, this was towards the end of his career. So he could have been hinting around at that. But if he was, it doesn't seem that he was ever afforded the opportunity. As described by his contemporary, Senator Thomas Hart Benton of Missouri, when Gaillard served as president pro tem, he kept order in the Senate, quote, not by authority of rules, but by the graces of deportment. There was probably not an instance of disorder or a disagreeable scene in the chamber during his long continued presidency. When the incoming Vice President John C. Calhoun left the special session of the 19th Congress early in 1825, Gaillard was once again turned to as the Senate's presiding officer. Unfortunately, this would prove to be his last time presiding from the rostrum, as John Gaillard passed away in Washington, D.C. on February 26, 1826, at the age of 60.
Wow.
His death was formally acknowledged by the Senate the next day, and a committee appointed for, quote-unquote, superintending his funeral. He was buried in the Congressional Cemetery, which is where his body remains to this day. And for anybody interested in learning more about the Congressional Cemetery, we actually had an episode come out around Halloween where we talked with Kurt Dion of the Congressional Cemetery about all the folks that are buried there, the history of the cemetery. So I recommend you checking it out, but just know that Gaillard is in the Congressional Cemetery in D.C. to this day. At the time of his death, he was the longest serving senator in U.S. history.
Wow.
Now, in terms of legacy, both of Gaillard's sons would become doctors. The oldest son, Edwin, passed away in 1834 at the age of 38.
Wow.
And Theodore passed away in 1855 at the age of 58.
They did not have longevity in their genes, did they?
They did not. They did not.
Wow.
But meanwhile, there was at least one person in the Gaillard family who would return to politics. His nephew, Theodore Gaillard Hunt, would serve one term as a U.S. representative from Louisiana from 1853 until 1855. But that is all that I was able to find on John Gaillard.
So I have to say it's hard to come up with a nickname, and it's a little bit boring, but he sounds like he was a really virtuous gentleman. So I'm going to say John Gaillard the Good.
We'll take it.
Seems pretty appropriate.
At least from what we know. And
from what we know.
He could be the John Gaillard the Good at fooling us.
Yes, but it sounds like he was a virtuous man. And definitely had a lot of headwinds leading up to and I guess ending his career.
Yeah. Yeah, he's one of those figures that, and it'll be interesting to see, as I progress into the Monroe presidency series, to see as I learn more about what was going on in Congress at that time, if he starts to show up more, if we get more about him. I don't really know, but it'll be interesting to see. And, at the very least, and I hope that our audience has enjoyed this brief look at a figure in the U.S. Senate who at one point was next in line for the presidency.
Yeah.
For 800-something days.
Yeah. Wow.
So with that, we wrap up this episode. Next up is Daniel D. Tompkins.
DDT.
DDT.
That's his nickname already.
Good old DDT. And believe you me, he is an interesting character.
In a good or a bad way.
And on that note.
Okay. Well, so DDT fits, huh? Toxic man-made chemical compound.
I will say he leaves a complicated legacy.
Okay.
And we'll talk more about that
I think
time.
DDT is a pretty fitting nickname already, and I don't even know anything about this guy, so looking forward to it.
But we'll find out more about him next time. But in the meantime, thank you all so much for listening. The website is presidenciespodcast.com. If you'd like to find out sources used for this episode, believe me, I did a lot of research to try and gather up what little I could for this episode. So if you want to learn more and find out more about John Gaillard, that's the place to do it. You can also check out past episodes of the podcast. You can find out more about all of the American presidents. I have links to resources available on the internet, other podcasts as well. You can find us on social media. We're available on Facebook, Mastodon, and Blue Sky as Presidencies, on the formerly known as Twitter at Presidencies89, and on Instagram and Threads as Presidencies Podcast. If you have any questions or comments, please feel free to reach out via email at presidenciespodcast@gmail.com. And thanks so much to our patrons for all of your support of the podcast. Thank you for everybody who shares information about the podcast. So if this is somehow your first episode, please go back. We've got tons of episodes for you to get caught up on. And I'm so excited about where we're going with the podcast. We've got some exciting things ahead. So I hope you'll join us next time. But until then, stay safe and healthy. Be kind to one another. And take care, dear friends.
In the middle of the continental U.S., there is a special stretch of land, formerly known as the Neutral Strip or No Man's Land. It was at one point the most lawless place in the world. In the heart of America and the middle of nowhere, a special group of people left their mark on this country, though their stories are not known to a wide audience. Our Nowhere Panhandle Histories details the fascinating, strange, and meaningful stories from the Oklahoma and Texas panhandles. Sponsored by Oklahoma Panhandle State University, tune in and hear all about the hidden heart of America.